like to introduce our renowned Civil War expert here.
Veteran.
If you've ever seen a picture of veteran, his identical great-grandfather obviously was a So, Bob, thank you for stepping in for us today.
Well, as Mike said, my name is Bob Moulder, also known as Plan B.
Bob, Plan B Moulder.
The Civil War, as all wars are, was obviously a very horrible war. As is in the handout that Mike put together, is sometimes called the first modern war. As far as technology is concerned, but the last of the Middle Ages as far as medical science was at that point. Basically, and by no means am I a medical expert, but basically, if you were hit in the extremities by something this size or this size, about all they could do was cut it off. If you were hit in the trunk area, your chances of recovery were very, very slim. To give you some idea of the carnage, we're going to play a little excerpt on Pickett's charge from the movie Gettysburg, which is really quite accurate.
I'm not certain this is actually the one from the movie, which is superb. We're giving you the sense of what it was like to be a soldier, but let's see what this one comes up.
Okay. This is it.
Oh, it is. Now, let's get some volume.
How much did it take?
I think you get the idea. Actually, in the filming of this movie, I had several friends that participated, and one of them said, if you look real carefully, you can see me shooting myself. They didn't have a whole bunch of reenactors, so they would film the Union side, and then they would film the Confederate side. And as I say, he claims you can see him shooting himself. I guess I don't quite know how to describe it, but the tactics of the time dictated the massed formations. Why? Probably because of the limited training in many cases, also communication. That gives you some idea of the noise. One soldier wrote home that the only way he knew his weapon had fired was to look for the recoil. And he was a cannoneer. He was talking about his cannon. He could not tell it went off unless it recoiled. One part of that movie, which would have liked to have stopped it, but my plan B technical expert couldn't figure out which button to push. It showed just before the Confederates got to the guns, it showed a gun firing. That was a gun of Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery, which was down to 2 guns, I believe, at the time, out of 6. The man commanding that battery, a man named Alonzo Cushing, had already been mortally wounded in the groin area. He and the sergeant were the only men left to fire that gun. He was the man that had to stop the vent. Now what that means is on a muzzle-loading cannon, of course there are 2 holes. The big one where you throw the stuff in, and the back one where you put the priming mechanism. You have to cover that when you're loading it so that no oxygen can get down there and ignite any sparks. Otherwise the guy loading it is in deep trouble. You usually have a leather mitten that you put over your thumb. Alonzo, being the commander of the battery, did not have that. He used his bare thumb. The hot gases burned through to the bone. But they fired the gun. He died, of course. And just recently, I think a year or 2 ago, he was posthumously, of course, awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, what was that gun firing? It was firing canister. Canister is basically a great big shotgun shell. This is from a 12-pound gun. He was firing a 3-inch ordnance rifle. This would be a little bit more than he was firing, but there were 12-pounders there. Each 12-pounder had 27 of these iron balls in it. Or it could be as high as 40. This one has 40. Just depended what size balls they were using, but we'll use 27 as the norm. He was actually firing triple canister. What that means is he took the first one he put in had the powder bag. Then he would knock the powder bag off the subsequent ones and just put in the shotgun shell, if you will. So when it went off, you had basically a street cleaner. Just all these iron balls going down. There's a lot of question about the wounds during the Civil War. For instance, many authors will say that the medical reports indicate that the bayonet was not used very much, or the saber was not used very much, because examining the wounds of the wounded, they found very few, relatively few, bayonet wounds or saber wounds. So therefore, the bayonet and saber were not used very much. I'll go along a little bit with the saber, but the bayonet is basically a crowd control weapon. It went on the end of the musket like this, like that. You do not need to stick anybody for the bayonet to work. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the 1st Minnesota was on Cemetery Ridge. There were 267 men in that unit. There were only 8 companies left. General Hancock rode up to the colonel commanding and said, "You have to give me 5 minutes. You must stop those people." Those people were 1,600 men of Cadamus Wilcox Confederate Brigade. The colonel of those 8 companies said, "Fix bayonets," and they charged down Cemetery Ridge. Now, did they stick anybody? I have no idea. I mean, if I was one of those 1,600 men down there and roughly 300 men came screaming down with that 18-inch sticker out in front, I'd get out of the way. And they did. Now, the other thing about a bayonet charge, imagine that bayonet's out there. If you get real close, you also have another weapon. It's called a butt stroke. So, those 267 men, as it turned out, stopped that charge for 15 minutes. It gave General Hancock enough time to bring in reinforcements to cover that part of Cemetery Ridge. But about only 70 of those 267 men of the 1st Minnesota got back on the ridge. So, was the bayonet used? Absolutely. Was it effective? Absolutely. Was anybody stuck with it? Who knows? The other thing about the bayonet is, as I mentioned, wounds in the trunk were basically fatal. If you're charging somebody with a bayonet, you don't aim for the toes or the hand, you aim for here. Those surgeons were examining the wounded, not the dead. Anybody here would have died, or most of them would have. So that statistic, I think, is flawed. Yes, they didn't examine very many wounded with bayonet wounds or saber wounds, but again, the saber is a crowd control weapon. If you are in the infantry, formed in line, and a bunch of horsemen come screaming down at you with a saber sticking out, you'll probably get out of the way. Would the charge have been effective? Yep. But for very many people slashed with the saber, who knows? It also, with the saber, took a whole bunch of training for the saber to really be effective, for the soldier, the trooper, to know how to use it. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the famed Confederate cavalry commander, was attacked fairly early in the war by a soldier, Union soldier with a saber, and he killed the Union soldier. But his comment was, if he had known how to use the saber, I would have been dead. but instead of doing real harm, he was just flailing with it. One of the things I brought is this display here. This and the sword belong to George Gregory Stambro. George Stambro grew up in New York and was studying medicine under a doctor in the town of New York. Now that, at that time, that's basically all you had to do to become a doctor, is study underneath somebody else. When the war broke out, the doctor, which quite often the case, being a prominent man in the community, raised a company of infantry. In this case, Company F, the 116th New York. He then made himself the captain. Being a doctor, of course, he had a great deal of military experience. That's sarcastic. And he named his protege the lieutenant of the company, also a man with great military experience. But this happened a lot at the beginning of the Civil War on both sides. A prominent person who had some money and some standing in the community was the obvious person to get people to rally around the flag, if you will. Shortly after forming the company, the captain transferred, and I don't really know where he went. And George Stambro, his protege, became the captain of Company F of the 116th New York. In 1863, the 116th New York was part of Banks' army that was besieging the Confederate fort at Port Hudson, Louisiana, which is downstream on the Mississippi from Vicksburg. It was supposedly a two-pronged campaign, one to attack Fort Gibson, the other to attack Vicksburg. Banks, not being a terribly aggressive commander, didn't do his job very well. But on May the 27th, 1863, there was an attack on Port Hudson. The 116th New York was one of the few regiments that really pressed the attack. And during that attack, Captain Stambro was undoubtedly waving a sword at the time because his scabbard got a bullet through it. It's been repaired, of course. Shortly thereafter, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not making fun of him. Shortly thereafter, Captain Stambro resigned his commission. Now, I have read many resignations. I had a pistol once belonging to a man that was in the cavalry, and his resignation papers was a voluminous report of why he wanted to resign. His colonel endorsed it with one word: incompetent. George Stambro was a different deal. His letter of resignation was, and I'm paraphrasing of course, but I'd like to resign my commission as captain of Company F, 116th New York, to make way for someone with more experience than I have. And I would like to transfer then to the regular Army as an assistant surgeon to use my experience to better further the cause, etc. I think that's legitimate. He did resign his commission in the infantry and became the assistant surgeon at the U.S. Army Hospital in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he served throughout the war and incidentally met his future wife in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, I presume, and they were married after the war. After the war, he got out of the Army and had a successful medical practice in New York. The items shown here are his commission, a picture of him as an infantry officer wearing this sword, a picture of him as an assistant surgeon, his obituary, his Grand Army of the Republic medal. Grand Army of the Republic, as probably most of you know, was the American Legion of the Civil War, the Union version of the American Legion. His Masonic medal, his glasses, and some other items. How I got that, I think, is a rather strange story. A fellow I knew who had run an ad in the Yellow Pages, those of you who are old enough remember what the Yellow Pages were, and said he was collecting military equipment. Gregory Stambro, the fourth probably, who lived up in Telluride, or Fairplay, I guess, called him and said, I've got a sword I'd like to sell. Well, the guy referred him to me. And we got together, and he brought all that stuff. And I said, well, why do you want to sell it? He said, well, my mother put this together, and I don't have any children. My brother doesn't have, well, I don't have any boys. My brother doesn't have any boys. So I have nobody to pass it down to, and I need the money and I want to sell it. I tried to talk him out of it. Or I tried to tell him other ways to sell it because I didn't think I could give him what the full worth was. He said, that's okay, I'll take what you get. Anyway, I paid him. But I said, and I wrote him a letter, I don't want your mother coming after me now. Well, this was a guy in his 30s. He said, oh no, she won't care. Well, baloney, she won't care. About 6 months later, I get a letter, or no, he called me. And he said, my mother is still ragging at me for selling that stuff. Do you still have it? I said, yeah. You want to get rid of it? No, that's why I bought it. He said, well, that's good. The reason I tell that story is that unfortunately that happens a lot. And that's what this museum is about. To a smaller degree, that's what I'm about, is preserving history and preserving the stories. You know, if I hadn't bought it, it'd probably have sold it to somebody else, but would the story have been preserved? I have no idea. But again, that's what this museum does. As the doctor would have, I'm sure, explained to us all that, again, medical practices during the medical science during the Civil War, pretty much medieval. The bone saw was one of the most important things in their medical kit. They did have quinine to treat malaria. This is a bottle, can, in which quinine was stored. One of the things that they did, and I wish the doctor was here because I am unsure about this. I am not certain that they were still opening veins to get the bad blood out. But if they were, this is what they would have used. They also had a rather interesting version of this that was spring-loaded, which just the thought of that scared the hell out of me. They put it on the vein and press this button and these are extremely sharp, so I'll have them out here, but please don't handle them. They did have chloroform. I am certain that there were cases where they ran out of those things, especially in the South. Now, there's a quote in your handout from Stonewall Jackson that he was sedated enough when they amputated his arm that he could hear the noise of the saw but felt no pain. Yeah, but he was a general. I'm sure that he got a pretty good dose. Again, I wish the doctor was here because I wanted to ask him about this. We've all heard the term bite the bullet. This bullet, which happens to be a Confederate bullet, was found near a Confederate hospital. I think it was in South Carolina, in the Carolinas anyway, and obviously has teeth marks on it. Now, there's another explanation. Are these human teeth marks, or are they from a pig? Wild pigs, domestic pigs, really liked rooting around hospitals because there was all that fresh meat out there. So nobody knows. This could be a bite the bullet. Don't know. I point that out only because there's a lot of myths that come out about the Civil War, well, about all conflicts. There's probably some truth in most of them, but there's also maybe some other explanations. One of the, and I didn't bring a good example, but one of the myths, now this sword has a flat blade, this happens to be a Confederate one, but you'll see most swords of the period have grooves in the blade. The common myth is, well, that's so they wouldn't get stuck in the wound. That's a blood groove. Baloney. Those are called fullers. The reason they're put in there is to improve the balance of the blade. A solid blade weighs more. You put these grooves in there. It does not affect the strength of the blade. It makes the blade lighter, improves the balance. That Confederate one doesn't have it. The reason being, it was easier to make that way. As I mentioned earlier, the weapons fired very large projectiles. The most common infantry weapon of the time was, by mid-war anyway, was a .58 caliber rifle musket. What that means is the gun was of musket length, but had rifling in it. Excuse me just a minute. Which meant it was more accurate at longer ranges than the earlier smoothbore musket. smoothbore would be like a shotgun. The rifle musket fired bullet this size, 58 caliber, roughly a 20 gauge shotgun. It had a hollow base, so when you loaded it from the muzzle, it was small enough to go down, but when the powder exploded behind it, it spread the base, so it took the rifling coming out. Now that's a pretty big slug. I would not want to get hit with that. But it's soft lead, so it mushrooms. These are what is commonly called soft tissue impact. And it could also be could be mud, could also be in a horse. But basically, it's what happens when a projectile that size hits soft tissue. It expands, it mushrooms, and is devastating. And that's from the small one. This is the 69 caliber version, which was used in this gun. This was also a rifle musket, although the terminology is rifled, meaning R-I-F-L-E-D, because this gun started off as a smoothbore and then was rifled before the war and fired the 69 caliber. I don't have an example of that mushroomed, but that's got to be even bigger. The war started out with a lot of these. This is the smoothbore. Incidentally, this happens to be a Confederate-made version. This is a Confederate-converted version. This is U.S. I mean, I've got U.S. examples of all of these. I have a rule. I limit what I bring out of the basement to 3 loads. The Union versions would have made it 4, so. And also, I didn't realize I was going to be the Plan B speaker, so. But the smoothbore version fired a 69 caliber round ball and 3 buckshot. It's called the buck and ball load. Long range accuracy, there isn't any. In fact, it doesn't even have rear sight. 50 yards is probably maximum, but with a load like that, you don't have to be accurate. One of the things that if my assistant had known how to stop that movie, after the apex of Pickett's charge, when Armistead goes over the wall and says, take the cannons, etc., they briefly show a Union regiment. That Union regiment, I believe, was the 12th New Jersey. Might have the number wrong, but anyway, it was a New Jersey regiment. They were armed with the smoothbores. Seeing what was probably going to happen, they took their cartridges, opened them up, threw the round ball away, and loaded them with 18, 20, whatever, of the small 31 caliber shot. They were making them into shotguns. There were roughly 300 to 400 of these men. I am unclear whether they actually got to fire them, but they were ready. They had loaded 16 gauge shotguns, basically. That would have been devastating if they had fired them. And I'm unclear whether they actually did or not. But that gives you some idea of the horrible effectiveness of these weapons, especially at close range. Now, these two were certainly accurate, 150, 200 yards. I have fired a gun, the original of these, at 150 yards, and I can get most of my shots in a paper plate. However, nobody was shooting at me. Makes a hell of a difference. Also, there was not a whole bunch of smoke. That one of the reasons Mike and I thought we ought to show that video clip is because of all the smoke. The way the smoke was generated, it was difficult to see much further than 100, 150 yards, if that. So the increased accuracy of these was, it can be argued how effective that was, but certainly they were more accurate than the smoothbore. The disease, of course, was one of the biggest killers, if not the biggest killer. There's a movie I sort of like. Historically, it's questionable. John Wayne movie called The Horse Soldiers. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Oh, it was pretty good. It was certainly entertaining. William Holden plays a doctor of this Union cavalry unit. And during the campaign, he confronts a colonel of a volunteer regiment and says something to the effect of, "Colonel, your coffee would taste better if you built your latrines downstream rather than upstream." Well, that sounds funny, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if that hadn't happened. Human sanitation, especially from the rural communities, both north and south, was virtually unknown. And so, especially early in the war, a lot of folks just got rid of their excess wherever they happened to be. Even after rudimentary sanitation came in play, camps were moved every few weeks just because they had to. There's no place else to dig the latrines. Certainly, as bad as that was, the conditions in the prison camps was horrible. Much, much worse. We all use the Andersonville, the Confederate prison at Andersonville, Georgia, as an example. The Unions weren't a hell of a lot better, somewhat, but not a hell of a lot. There was one stream going through the Andersonville prison that was used both for drinking water and for sanitation. You can come up with your own ideas of what happened there. Not only that, but just simple diseases that we would just take for granted, like measles. Measles just wiped out bunches of people because, especially from the rural communities, they had no exposure. Now, the folks from the cities, usually Union, but not always, certainly had more exposure to those diseases and probably had a better immune system. Those from the country had no immune system. Measles, whooping cough, certainly the more serious ones, pneumonia, typhoid fever, malaria, just decimated whole camps, whole armies. It was not a fun time. I used to do some reenacting, and I always had problems with the reenactor that said, "Boy, I wish I was back in those times." Baloney. Not me. interesting to read about it. It's interesting to know history. But would I have wanted to live back there, knowing what I know now? Absolutely not. Most of us would have died. And not just from the weapons, but from the diseases. One of the reasons that there were so many Civil War widows that were outliving the soldiers is because they were usually the second or third wife. Because the veteran had a pension, they were a good match for a young woman. She also, in the later years, didn't have to worry about him chasing her around the house very much. But the women died early, mainly because of childbirth, among other things. So no, those weren't the good old days as far as I'm concerned. Are there questions? Again, this is a plan B, and I hadn't thought I was going to be the plan A. The young man back there.
Thank you. Say that again, will you, please?
Speak up, boys. Speak up. I'm old.
Hey, Bob, you know, one of the things that I've read about is when the surgeons in a battle, when they got hundreds of men coming in that are wounded, how did they distinguish between the ones they were going to treat and how the ones they weren't going to treat?
I'm sorry, Dave.
How did the surgeons determine what men they were going to treat first and what ones they weren't going to treat?
Triage.
Well,
The triage, yes.
if I understand the question, I think it was probably you're wounded here, someplace in the trunk area, you'll wait because you're probably going to die anyway. If you're wounded someplace here, extremities, we'll treat you. And there are occasions, I want to say the grandson or the son of President Tyler had a trunk wound. I think I'm correct on this. And the surgeon basically set him to one side. And he lived. So then they started treating him. Another thing, and I did do reenacting for a while, and one of the things I did was we reenacted the Battle of Gettysburg, at Gettysburg. And we were there for 3 days. Now I cheated. I spent the night in a motel, but the uniform I wore for 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, it could stand up by itself. Now, when you think about it, and that didn't really sink into me until I was so smelly, but when you think about it, bullet this size going in takes a lot of this very dirty uniform with it. And that breeds infection. And so infection was a big killer also. Now my uniform I only wore for 3 days. Granted, it was in Pennsylvania, southern Pennsylvania in July. We had rain, we had heat, etc. That was just 3 days. These guys would go weeks, months without being able to wash. I have a letter from a Civil War captain. I have 110 of them, but one of them towards the end of his enlistment. And how he had a sense of humor after 3 years of this carnage, I have no idea, but he did. And in his letter, he writes home. He said, every night I conduct a campaign against the Graybacks. He's talking about lice. He said, I have adopted a black flag policy and take no prisoners. So every night he would go through the seams of his clothing and kill the lice. If he had the opportunity, he would boil his uniform. He was an officer, remember, so he had probably more access to that type of thing than the general enlisted man. And I can't imagine what the conditions were. Other questions?
I just wanted to share, I may have shared it with you before, but my great-great-grandfather was at the Battle of Stones River, Murfreesboro. He was in the 6th Kentucky, and at Stones River he took a bullet in the back, and he laid unattended in the battlefield for several days. And maggots cleansed his wound, and he survived. And we've often thought that had he gone to an operating table, he may not have survived.
I think that's probably true.
And let me say this, they never took the bullet out of him because it was lodged too close to the heart. So he took it to his grave.
Again, I wish the doctor was here, but I have heard during the Napoleonic Wars, and I can't confirm or deny this, that some soldiers would carry maggots with them to clean the wounds. I have in my collection a bunch of stuff from a man who at the Battle of Atlanta, was hit here. Blinded him in this eye, lodged in his skull. I don't know if they ever were able to take the bullet out. He died 7 or 8 years after the war from the effects of that bullet. You had a question, I believe.
What's the difference between canister and grape shot?
Okay, that's a very valid question. Grape shot was basically a naval round. Now I'm generalizing, but basically grape shot consisted of 9 balls, depending on the caliber of the gun, of various sizes. Usually about like that, and they were in a stack. The purpose was, and this goes back to the wooden ships, which, of course, were still around with the Civil War, was to create splinters. The best use of grape shot was, in the naval terms, when you crossed the stern, or possibly the bow, but usually the stern of another ship, fire down the length of it with grape shot. Not only were they big enough to cause severe damage to guns, people, etc., but created splinters. Splinters are every bit as deadly as shrapnel or anything. There were field guns, at least there was ammunition for field guns called grape shot. But that was basically Mexican War holdovers. Again, even maximum number you'd have maybe 12, 15 rounds, as opposed to 27 smaller balls. And you know, a ball this size is going to kill you just as good as a ball that size. That's a little overkill, in fact. So that is the difference. Unfortunately, the terms were used interchangeable. You will read a lot of first-person reports that say, the canister and grape flew heavily. Well, it was probably all canister. There were lots of different artillery rounds, which I didn't bring. But the canister was the close range one, 300 yards or closer. And as I mentioned, you could put 2 to 3 loads in a gun if things were really, really critical. Other questions? Jim?
Maybe a little perspective on antiseptic surgery. By 1865, it was still 2 years away. Joseph Lister in England started to spray phenol or carbolic acid on his instruments and on his surgical equipment, and the amount of gangrene he saw decreased rapidly, where in the Civil War you could still get gangrene and die from from an arm wound or a leg wound. They didn't know about germs.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, again, first person report. The surgeon would wipe his instruments on his bloody apron. Yeah, bacteria was unknown. They had no, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot to mention that. That was not my Plan B notes. Other questions? Well, thank you for coming and for listening to the Plan B speaker. You're welcome to come up and look at these items afterwards. As those of you who have been in the museum before know that as soon as we clean up the area, there'll be people here that would be glad to give you tours of the museum. And again, donations are gratefully accepted.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. And we hope you'll stay around and visit some here. But we have 3 diaries from Union soldiers in the Civil War, and they're back in the far back room where we have a small Civil War exhibit. And they're really quite fascinating. 2 of them basically list exactly where they were day by day. And at one point we put a map up in Northern Virginia and could plot exactly where he was. This one's interesting because it's more of kind of an actual diary. You know, it's his impressions going through there, and talks about his officers, his men, and what it was like in the first encounters. But what's also intriguing with William Saterway's experience, which wasn't necessarily unique, he was captured, paroled. This was out in the Illinois, kind of the western area. Rejoined his unit, was captured again, and this time they weren't fiddling around. He was sent off to Andersonville. And actually 2 of the gentlemen ended up in Andersonville. But again, if you have a little bit of time, just pick it up, sit down, and it's just fascinating reading all of this. So again, thank you again, Bob, and thank you for sticking with us today. We'll probably try and get Dr. Malin in later in the year.
Yeah, actually, if any of you had tried to leave, we had guards on the end. But thank you again for bearing with me.
A lot of refreshment.